Hi, I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader,
And I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
and we're the insiders. And so, hey, Scott, you filed a petition with the Supreme Court to change the rules so that redistricting will land in the Supreme Court as opposed to the federal courts. And with the governor as being a Democrat and Republicans in the majorities in the Assembly and the Senate, at least at this time, looks like that's going to happen. Tell us, what's your thought and what's your process?
Well, Chuck, you'll remember almost 2 decades ago when you were the leader of the Senate and I was the leader of the Assembly, we couldn't come to an agreement on redistricting. And so the Democrats went to federal court and the Republicans went to the state Supreme Court and said, you have to resolve these differences between the parties so that we can have some sort of redistricting go on here in Wisconsin. And we filed at the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and the Wisconsin made the case that legally, all the precedent is that these sort of cases should be handled at the state level. And we made the case to the Wisconsin Supreme Court that they should continue that precedent. And they said, well, you're right. You're absolutely right that these cases should be handled at the state court level. But we've never developed a process for doing redistricting at the Supreme Court level in Wisconsin. We don't have the resources to do it. And there's already a case the Democrats have filed in federal courts. So we'll let the feds handle this one. But Mr. Jensen, we promise that we will develop a process before the next redistricting. Well, in 2010, there didn't have to be one because the Republicans controlled everything, and so no case made it to the Supreme Court. But my filing with the court is just to say, hey, you made me a promise 18 years ago that you guys would come up with a process for handling redistricting at the state level. Since then, the federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court, have said these really should be handled at the state court, and the federal court should only be a last resort. So I'm just asking the Wisconsin Supreme Court to keep their promise to me from 18 years ago.
I guess my question would be, Scott, would you have filed this same request if Lisa Neubauer had won in her election? I kind of doubt it. This is all about partisan games, and Scott and I are pretty good at that. And Scott went to the Supreme Court, said he can rig this result for the Republicans. The bottom line is that you have an extraordinarily partisan court. By the way, the only possibility here for not getting a partisan blessing of a Republican map or something that looks like that so that they can say they made a change is if the apparent little bit of independence on the part of Brian Hagedorn, Justice Hagedorn, actually holds up to be true, and there's actually some reason for him to say, well, I'm not just going to go down a partisan route. That seems unlikely. But this is a partisan court. The candidates for the Supreme Court now, the Republican candidate for the Supreme Court, and I call him a Republican candidate because he had his election campaign headquarters in the Republican Party headquarters. So this is about rigging elections again. Now, yes, you can couch it in terms of, oh, we want our nonpartisan court to do it, but that's not what it is. It's all about having people, including a chief justice who has decided to set up a separate court for businesses because we want to make sure that they get good treatment in Wisconsin. The rest of you can kind of take a second seat. We want to have our decision made, you're saying, by a court that we've handpicked, and WMC has, a majority of those people. They got, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from Republican operatives. And now we're going to make sure that they handle our redistricting. It's terrible. It's wrong. It really ought to go to the federal court where there are lifetime justices who are maybe Republicans or Democrats when they're appointed, or at least appointed by Republicans or Democrats, but they have independence. They don't have to face election. These justices will all have to look over their shoulder and say, hey, who's going to be with me in 2 years or 3 years when I'm up for re-election? And by the way, dance with the ones who brung you. The Republicans got me here. They're going to keep me here. This isn't good. It can be couched in nonpartisan terms, but that's not what this is.
So you may remember 18, 19 years ago when we did go to the federal court on redistricting. In the end, they worked mostly off the map that the Republicans had submitted to the court. So we could win either way. I don't think it's a matter of the venue. I just want the Supreme Court of Wisconsin to keep the promise they made to me and the people of Wisconsin that this would be a state process unless it didn't work, and then it would go to the feds. Feds only as a last resort. Let's handle this at the state level. They promised they would do that. I'm just trying to hold them to their promise.
And you may recall that the only change that the federal courts made to that program that they put out, the map that they put out, was to change things dramatically in the 15th Senate district down in Rock County, which really did favor Democrats, but which also cleaned up their map. So they did show an ability to act on a bipartisan basis or on a nonpartisan basis and see the arguments of both sides come in. And you know, you have to respect that, of course. And we weren't happy with the result, but at the end, we at least got something done. And you'll notice that in the 2000s, we were back and forth. That's not where we are now. We have these partisan maps where Republicans have super majorities just about, where Democrats have no chance of winning. And now what will happen is that the Wisconsin Supreme Court will ratify that and make it permanent over the next 10 years. That is not a good thing for Wisconsin. It doesn't reflect the nearly even split in this state. And it's everybody who's an independent commentator on this has said it's wrong. Frankly, if I were the head of the Wisconsin Supreme Court and I wanted to show that this court actually has some independence, I would say, you know, because of the concerns, we're going to pass on this and we'll let the federal judiciary deal with it. That or else find some way to show that they can actually be nonpartisan in this. I don't see it happening, with that one caveat that I told you about Justice Hagedorn.
Well, you know what? The other thing that's of concern here is timing. You know, last time when I first ran for office, I was in the month of June. My wife and I were about to get married. We wanted to go look for a house, but I didn't know where my district was going to be. The courts didn't come down with an answer until June 4th. Even though the census has been delayed, whatever court ends up making a decision here, they need to develop this needs to get started sometime in the fall. We can't let this go deep into next year or it's going to be problematic for the elections.
I agree with you that timely decision is important, and this year it's particularly tough. It's always tough. In fact, the way I got into the legislature was because of redistricting, and someone had to make a last-minute decision on whether they would move into the new seat, and they did not. So you're right, this whole house swapping thing, but you know, I don't think the average person in the public cares what the impact is on us as
no, but we're the insiders. We care. So.
But we're the insiders, so we care, and so do all of the lobbyists, et cetera, that are around the building. But I don't think that Scott is doing anything that I wouldn't think that he would do in this kind of an environment. I just hope that somehow or another, whether it's the federal courts or otherwise, that we get a fair decision out of a nonpartisan group or a group that can find a way to do that. I don't see that happening with the Wisconsin Supreme Court in this state.
I'm sure we'll be talking about this again.
I expect
See you soon,
we will.
folks.
See ya.